Lumetri Color is found under the color correction category, and this is an effect that is found in both After Effects and Premiere, and is a great tool for color correction. In Premiere, there's a whole Lumetri Color panel that allows you to easily adjust all of these settings without having to look at the effects panel. But here in After Effects, we're going to adjust the controls just like we do any other effect. So I'm gonna click and drag this out on top of this HDR environment map that I got from HDRI Haven. And the reason I'm using this is because it has lots of color information. It's an HDR file. It has 32 bits of color information, so I'm working at 32 bits per channel. And what that means is that there's just a lot more information that can be displayed on my screen at one time. So if I grab my comp exposure right here and click and drag it down, you can see that there's actually blue sky here behind these trees. At its default, it's all blown out to white, but that color information is still there. And the same is true if I brighten this up. You can see in this little fireplace, there's plenty of detail in there. Or if I go over to maybe inside, you can see inside the house, there's a TV on a cabinet. There's just way more color information in this image than a standard 8-bit JPEG. And the reason that's nice is because Lumetri Color works with 32-bit images and it's also GPU accelerated. So if you have a GPU that's pretty powerful, this will take advantage of that and increase render speeds. Now I'm gonna make this look a little bit less distorted by adding an environment, CC environment effect on top of this. It'll go black until I add a new camera. So layer new camera, and I'll just make it really wide. We'll say 15 millimeters and click OK. And that's still pretty far zoomed in. So I'm gonna go into my camera options and zoom out even further. So we're looking a little bit more like this. And now I can just press C to get to my orbit tool and look around this like a photosphere. So this is what we're working with. Now that effect overwrites anything before it. So if I make any adjustments here, we're not gonna see them on the CC environment version. So I need to move Lumetri Color after that. But now we can take a look at these controls. And there are a lot of them, so bear with me, but we're gonna walk through each and every one of them. Now these are laid out in basically the order that you would typically use them in. Starting with basic color correction, and then moving on to creative adjustments, we have curves, color wheels, HSL Secondary, and finally the vignette. Obviously, you are in control of whatever workflow you want to use, so you can jump into any of these whenever you'd like, but this is a general workflow starting with basic correction and moving down the line. If you've done any developing inside of Lightroom, then these controls are gonna look very familiar to you. I'm gonna open up basic correction and we'll just take a look at what we have. First of all, under each section, we have a checkbox that says active. And this is an easy way to just disable or enable that section to see the changes that you're making to your image. Next is input LUT. So with this effect, we're able to load in any lookup table, which is used for adding a color grade to specific types of footage or renders. There's some presets here, or you could load anything you want. So if I grabbed any one of these, it's going to change the way that my image looks. And like I said, you can create custom LUTs so that you can just color grade any footage shot with a specific camera or in a specific format to look a certain way. I'm gonna change that back to none. Next up is white balance, and we have a white balance selector as well as a temperature and tint control. So if we just use temperature and tint, we can adjust the white balance to whatever we want, or we could find something that should be a neutral gray in our image. So maybe this fireplace, and I'll grab my eyedropper and then just click on that gray, and it makes a white balance adjustment. So my temperature and tint have automatically adjusted, and I can turn that off and back on to see that color shift. I could also say maybe I want to use the table instead. I'll click on that and it slightly adjusts. So that's how you can use the white balance controls. Next up is the tone. This is where we're going to control the overall brightness of our image. So I'm going to pan again over to where we can see the sky and then walk through these controls. First, we have exposure. So I can, again, turn down the exposure to a minimum of -7, and we're bringing back some of that blue color. Now, in addition to all of this, I'm gonna open up another panel if I go up to Window and down to Lumetri Scopes, and this is going to give me a readout of all of the pixel values in my comp. And this is getting a little bit cramped, so I'm just gonna scoot this over here so we have some more room to work. But what this is a readout of my entire comp from left to right. So the left part of this graph is representing the left part of my screen, and the right part is representing the right part of my comp. Everything in between is how bright all of the pixels in the individual color channels really are. On this side, you see 0 to 255. This is the standard 8-bit, which we can see down here, range of brightness values. Pure black is 0% brightness, pure white is 255. And you can see all of this white up here at the top. This is clipped off values, things that are above that 255 range that are just blowing out to pure white. So if I reset my effect, a lot more of my image is getting clipped off because of the way that this image was exposed. Bringing that exposure down takes all of that clipped information and brings it back in. Well, not all of it, some of it is still clipped off. But this scope is allowing me to see that there is color information beyond what I'm actually seeing. So that exposure simulates the exposure of a camera. I can increase or decrease it as I want, but I'll just set that back down to 0 and we'll take a look at the next control, which is contrast. I can make that more or less, and as you can see in my scopes, that's making the darks darker and the brights brighter. So maybe I want to dial that exposure back a little bit and then increase and decrease that contrast until I have something that I like. Next up is highlights. And again, this is a range of brightness values, kind of around the halfway mark up to around here. As I bring those highlights down, you can see that waveform dropping or increasing. And over here, you can see what areas of my image are being affected. It's not the extreme highlights that we have up here in the sky. It's more of what's in the sunlight here and maybe on the ground. Shadows is next, and this is kind of the opposite of the highlights. It's more of this section of my scopes. I could brighten up the shadows underneath these bushes here, or make them a little darker if I wanted. Next, we have whites, and this is going to be a higher part of my range, and will bring more detail into the sky. Again, if I bring that exposure all the way down and turn those whites up and down, you can see that it's affecting those much more bright areas a lot more. And then finally, we have blacks, and this is going to get the darkest parts of our image. If I raise this too much, you can see that this is basically the floor of my color information. If anything was supposed to be black in my image, it no longer is. If I want to bring something down to black, it needs to hit this bottom line here of a value of 0. So I'm gonna bring those blacks down until I see something hit that floor. So right about there, I know that there's something black in my image now. We also have this reset button, so I'm just gonna hit that. This will reset only my tone controls and not everything else in my effect. So that's the difference between this reset and this reset right here. We also have an auto button. If I click that, it's going to attempt to automatically kind of balance out the image in this environment map where you can literally see everything in a 360-degree view. That's not very realistic since we have such a huge dynamic range of colors. So that didn't make anything look that great, but it might work for what you need. And finally, in our basic correction, we have saturation. And this is just an overall global saturation adjustment. I could desaturate everything, or I could really increase the saturation. Okay, I'm gonna set that back to its default and just make a few adjustments real quick. I'm gonna lower the exposure a little bit, maybe bring down the highlights a little bit as well as the whites. I think I could back off that exposure even more actually, and then maybe those highlights are a little too low. And then bring up the shadows just a little bit. And I can leave the blacks right where they are. And if I turn this off and back on, you can see that we're now just getting a much more balanced image. And we're seeing a lot more detail in the sky as well as in the shadows. All right, I'm gonna collapse up basic correction, and next up is creative adjustments. Here we can load in a look, and this is again something that we can create custom looks, but Lumetri Color comes bundled with a lot of different looks. So I could choose any one of these presets, and let's just say clean Kodak A, high dynamic range. And that's gonna give an overall color grade, basically, to my image. This is without and with, and maybe that's a little bit too dark, so I'll just switch this to maybe clean Fuji neutral dynamic range, and that looks slightly different. So feel free to play around with all of those presets. There's also an intensity slider, so if you think that this is still a little bit too contrasty, I could back this off a little bit and just apply that look a little bit less. All right, I'm gonna change that back to none. I don't need a look right now. But in here we have the creative adjustments. The first one is faded film. If I increase this, it's basically just going to raise the darks and wash out all of those shadows. If I do this too much, obviously it's gonna get really washed out really quickly, but maybe you just wanna add a touch of washed out faded film look, then you can just increase that a little bit. I'll set that back to 0. Next is sharpen. If I zoom in here a little bit closer where we can see some detail and I increase the sharpness, everything's just gonna get a little bit more crisp. If I really overdo it, then that's gonna be really extreme, but that's exactly what sharpen is doing. Vibrance is really interesting. This is the same as the vibrance effect. What it's attempting to do is increase the saturation of your entire image without oversaturating things. So if I turn that up to 100 and then turn this off and back on, you can see that everything did get more saturated, but it's not crazy saturated. I'll turn that back down to 0 and go to the next property, which is just saturation. and increase that to its maximum, and it's really oversaturated now. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the difference between the two. Now, the reason they included a saturation slider here is because all of these adjustments happen in this stacked order. So first, basic correction adjustments happen, and then the look would be applied, and then each one of these adjustments in order. So if you get to this point and you've added a look and maybe faded the film, even if you've adjusted the saturation to what you liked in this basic correction, it might have been too saturated once you've made other adjustments or not saturated enough. So that's why there's a secondary saturation control right here where you could dial it back or increase it a bit. Next up is split toning, and this is basically a way to offset the colors of the shadows and the highlights. So if I wanted to give my shadows a little bit of a blue tint, then I'm going to click and drag this crosshair towards those blues. The further towards the outer part of the circle I get, the more saturated that tint is going to be. Or if I wanted to warm it up instead, I could go in the opposite direction towards these yellows and just give everything a little bit more of an amber color. So I'll turn that off and back on, and you can see how that's affected the colors. But that's just the shadow tint. I could also go to my highlight tint and maybe go in the opposite direction, giving my highlights a cool blue. Or maybe something really crazy, I'll just make it this bright magenta. It's two individual controls that affect different ranges of your colors. And to reset these, you just double click on either one of them. But actually, let me undo so that I have that tint one more time, and then we have a tint balance slider. And this is basically shifting which has more influence, the shadow or the highlight. If I go to a negative number, we're gonna get more of the highlight tint, and if I go to a positive number, we'll get more of that shadow tint. All right, let me reset these back to where they were, and that's it for the creative section. Next up is curves, and this is actually a pretty complex section. We have access to a standard RGB curve, just like the curves effect, but there's actually a lot more that you can do in this section. First of all, there's an active checkbox for all of the curves, but then there's an active checkbox for each one of these curves. So I'm going to collapse the hue and saturation curves, and we'll focus on just RGB curves to start with. Like I said, this is just like the curves effect. So I could click and drag here and adjust the gamma basically of my image to make everything brighter or darker. And this is all, again, compounded on whatever adjustments you've made up here. And just like the shadow and highlight tint, if you double click on the curve, it will reset it. So this white circle means that I'm adjusting all three color channels together. I'm just adjusting the brightness. But if I go to the red circle, then I'm on the red channel, and I could add maybe a red S curve, go to the green, do the same thing. And then on the blue, I could bring down the highlights, increase the shadows, and then I've got kind of an Instagrammy looking filter. Again, I can turn that off and back on, but that's really all you need to know about the RGB curve. It's exactly the same as the curves effect. If I want to reset this, I'll just go to each one of these color channels, double click on it, and it will be reset. All right, next up is the hue and saturation curves, and this is where you can do a lot of really interesting things. First of all, we have hue versus saturation selector. There are actually 5 different curves that we can adjust in this section. Hue versus saturation, hue versus hue, hue versus luma, luma versus saturation, and saturation versus saturation. So the way that these names work is basically the first word is what we'll use to select part of our image, and the second word, or whatever its verse is what we're actually adjusting. So the hue versus saturation is going to allow us to select a specific range of hue or color, and then adjust its saturation. And this works a little bit differently than anything else in After Effects. So I'm gonna actually just show you this eyedropper first. The hue versus saturation selector allows you to just grab this eyedropper and then pick a color. So I'm gonna choose this grass green color, and we've got 3 dots now showing up on our curve. And this represents a range on the color spectrum. So the left and right dots are kind of the start and end of that range. And the one in the middle is our adjustment curve, basically. So if I click and drag on that dot and drag it way down, all of my grass is gonna get a lot less saturated. I'll turn that off and back on, and you can see that we lost a lot of saturation there. Or I could click and drag that in the opposite direction and really boost the colors of my grass. So this curve is increasing the saturation across this hue range. And I could increase this range just by clicking and dragging this point to the left and this point to the right. And now we're going to be affecting more of our image with this saturation adjustment. And if I wanted to affect more ranges, like say the blue, I could do this just by hand with the pen tool. If I click right here to add a point and then another one right here, this will loop around to the other side, and I already have a control point there. So I'll just click and drag this up to increase the saturation of my sky. And maybe the green grass is a little too saturated. I'll dial that back and then check this off and back on, and we have very selective adjustments this way. I could also pan around this graph just by using the scroll bar to see those points a little bit more accurately. If you wanted to remove any one of these controls, say this one right here, I'll just hold down Control or Command and click to remove that point. Or to reset the entire curve, I'll just double click in the graph. So that's hue versus saturation. The next option is hue versus hue. So this means that we're going to select a range of hues, but then also modify those hues. So let's again choose that green color. I'll just grab my eyedropper, click on that grass, and then increase or decrease this point one more time. Now, instead of having a saturation line vertically, I have a hue cycle on this vertical line. So this is allowing me to see that I'm basically taking this green color and I could move it up to this red area, and now my grass is going to be more red. If I want to get more or less of that range, I'll just increase the width of this again, and now I'm changing the colors of that green. Maybe I want to make that grass a little bit more blue, kind of like an alien world or just a creative color grading choice. That's exactly the kind of adjustment you can make with hue versus hue. Let me reset that and we'll go to the next option, which is hue versus luma. So luma meaning luminosity or the brightness of the pixels. This time, let's grab, say, this sky color. And then I'll pan this over so we can see these controls. And I'm just going to click and drag this down. Now our vertical line is luminosity, a brightness value. And if I bring that down, we're going to get a lot more detail in that sky. Now you can see that that is getting kind of posterized around the edges. It's getting very chunky. And that's just because of the order of the operations of this effect. These curves aren't really able to grab all these super bright overexposed pixels. So if I wanted to, I could go back into my exposure, dial that back a little bit more, maybe decrease the highlights as well, and even the whites a bit more to bring back some more of that sky detail. Then come back down to my hue versus luma, and maybe widen this out a little bit more so I select more of that sky. And I could even add another point by clicking right here and dragging this down to make my curve a little bit more tight. Now this is a very extreme adjustment, but you can see what exactly you're able to do with this. All right, I'm gonna double click on that to reset it, collapse that up, and next up is luma versus saturation and saturation versus saturation. So in this case, we're going to use luminosity as our selector, or the brightness of the pixels, and adjust the saturation with it. So I'm gonna use my Luma selector to, again, eyedropper that grass just because it's very easy to see. And we have a fairly decent sized patch of grass that's all basically the same luminance. Now, if I click and drag on this left point right here, I can increase or decrease the saturation of that range of luminance values. If I just add some points here and make some adjustments, you can see how different parts of my image are being affected. This range right here is hitting more of this brighter spot of sun on the ground, as well as what's over here on the door and the bricks. I could also just grab a point in the middle, a single point, and increase the saturation overall, and then maybe decrease some of the areas that I don't want to be oversaturated. Again, it's just a very precise and unique control for saturation. And then finally, we have saturation versus saturation. So the grass is fairly saturated. This time I'm gonna sample the part of the grass that's in the sunlight, and then I can just increase or decrease the saturation for that specific saturation. So the difference between this and the hue versus saturation, it's selecting anything that has that same saturation regardless of its hue. So if there's some blue that has similar saturation and some orange that has the same saturation levels, we're affecting all of those saturation levels equally. But that's the last saturation curve. I'm gonna reset that and collapse this up. And the next section is color wheels. Here we have color controls for our shadows, midtones, and highlights. All three of these wheels behave very similarly to the split toning that we had in the creative section. But instead of just shadows and highlights, we also have a midtones control. So if I wanted to take the midtones of my image and make them a little bit more pink, I could just click and drag this in that direction. Or if I wanted to be a little bit more natural, I'll just make more of a golden hour look by dragging this towards the yellowish orange color a little bit more. This slider on the left-hand side adjusts the brightness range for the midtones. So if I increase this really high, everything in the midtones will get much brighter. If I drag it down low, it's gonna bring those midtones down darker. I like them where they were, so I'm gonna double click on that to reset it. Then I can do the same thing for the shadows. I could drag this to maybe a cooler color, or go along with this golden hour look and increase it more. Obviously, there's a lot of shadows in this image, so minor adjustments to this are gonna make a big difference. So I'm gonna drag that back towards the center so it's not quite as extreme, and then maybe drag the darkness down just a little bit as well. Then we have the highlights. I'll grab that and increase that towards the yellows until I get something that I'm happy with, and then maybe brighten that up just a little bit. So this is before and after. All right, I'm gonna reset all of these, and then we'll move on to the next section, which is HSL Secondary, which stands for Hue, Saturation, and Lightness. And this is another very precise way of selecting specific colors or tones within your image. If I go to the key section, this is where we choose what parts of our image we want to actually adjust. And we have 3 eyedropper color selectors to make this selection. The first one is called Set Color. So again, just because it stands out, I'm gonna choose this green with my eyedropper tool, and nothing changes. But if I check this box that says Show Mask, it's going to show me the range of colors that are selected based on that eyedropper selection. Now this menu right here is the view mode of this mask, and it's showing me color for the selected parts of my image and gray for the unselected. But I could change this to color over black, and that's a little bit easier for me to look at. I think I understand that a little bit more clearly. Or I could change that to white and black, and then it looks more like a traditional mask. White is what's being selected, black is not. I could also invert that mask, so I'm selecting everything but that green. But let's jump back up to this Add Color and Remove Color. I'll change this back to color over black and then uncheck Show Mask. And what this allows me to do is choose another color to add to my range. So if I were to grab that eyedropper and then choose maybe this brown color of the door and then turn that mask back on, now we're not only getting the green, but also this brown. I can also remove a color from my mask. So let's say that this brick down here, I'm not liking that. I'm gonna use that Remove Color eyedropper and click on it, and that will take out that color from my selection. Now we have one more section here, HSL Sliders, and this is Hue, Saturation, and Lightness. If I open this up, it's actually a pretty complex menu, but it allows us to make much more precise keys with these controls. Now these selections you see on these range sliders are based on the color that I chose for my set color. If I turn that mask back off and grab that eyedropper and change it to say this in blue, all of these are going to update. So let me undo back to the green that we had. First, it's going to choose a range of hues. That's what the H stands for, is hue. And we can adjust this by clicking and dragging on this top triangle, and that will adjust the hue proportionally on each side. Everything between this point and this point on this hue slider is now selected in our key. I'll turn my mask back on so we can see that. If I make this narrower, we're going to have less show up in our key. So let's make that a little bit wider. I could also click and drag the middle to shift this around the hue cycle. So I'm getting some more blues here. I could go to the magentas. There's not that much magenta in this view, but let's put it back to where we were, somewhere around the greens. And then I can expand the softness or the fall off of this selection by grabbing this triangle down here and clicking and dragging it to the right. You can see that we're getting a linear fall off from this point to this point of the hue range. Same thing on the opposite side. I could bring this in a little bit tighter so that I'm still pretty much just getting the greens, but it's going to be a softer fall off from what's selected and what isn't selected. And I can make this same type of adjustment for both the saturation and the lightness as well, and disable or enable any one of these. So if I don't want to base my key on a hue range, I can just uncheck that and we'll only pick it from the saturation and the lightness. So if I don't want to use a range of color, I just want this specific color, I could uncheck the hue and it's just going to give me that color that I chose, but then I can have a range of saturation and lightness. I'm going to leave that on, but then I'll go to the next option of saturation. I could dial this back, maybe even narrow this so that I'm selecting only pixels that are in a very narrow range of saturation, a very desaturated set of pixels. Or I could say only select the most saturated greens, which just gives me so much more control for what specifically I want to choose. Same thing for the lightness. If I drag this over to the right, then I'm only going to be getting the brightest pixels here, or I could make that a little bit softer, maybe even a little bit wider, and select more of what's in my image. Now, like I said, all of these are based on this color that I chose, but if I click the reset button so it's back to its defaults, then I could select preset ranges like red, yellow, green, all the way down the line, and modify from there. You don't have to use these colors up here. These are just a tool for getting a selection started, basically. All right, let's say that I'm happy with this selection. I could always reset it if I want to, but I'm happy with this key. Next up is refine, and this is where we can soften out this mask, basically. So let me zoom in here nice and close, and you can see it's pretty chunky, pretty hard. I could, number one, denoise my key, and that will attempt to clean stuff up a little bit. This particular instance, it's not really noisy as much as it's just hard. So the next option is really what I want, a blur, and this just softens the edges. So I'll increase that just a little bit, and now I have a softer selection around that range of colors. Let me go back into my key and make sure to uncheck Show Mask, and next up is where we can actually make color correction adjustments based on that selection that we just made. Within here, we have a whole set of color wheels. It's just displayed a little bit differently. By default, it's affecting everything at once. So I could just drag this towards the blue, and now all of that selection that I made in my keying options is getting that blue tint or red or whatever I want. I can increase or decrease the brightness of just that color range, or I could go into my three-way color wheels and do these exact same shadow, mid-tone, highlight adjustments as we did in the color wheel section. So I could bring the highlights of this specific range of greens to be more yellow, and do the same thing with the midtones and the same thing with the shadows. And now we're giving an overall color cast. Maybe I want to bring the shadows to this darker blue color and give that specific range of colors a very unique look. It's again, just a very precise level of control for a specific range of colors. But that's not all we can do. Let me reset these back to default, close up the color wheels, and we also have the color temperature. So I could change that range of colors just with a slider like this to make it warmer or cooler. I could change the tint or the contrast. I could sharpen up just that range of colors, and I could increase or decrease the saturation for just that range, similar to the way that we use these saturation curves. Okay, I'll reset those back to their defaults. That's it for HSL Secondary, and then finally we have the Vignette section. And this is where we can just add a very simple, easy to use vignette to our entire image. If I drag the amount down, we're going to get a darkened outer ring around the outside of our frame, simulating a natural vignette that you get as an artifact of camera lenses. Or I could correct the vignette by increasing this to a larger number and bring back some of the detail around the outside edges of the frame. I'm gonna make this really dark just so it's very clear to see what's going on. And then the next option is midpoint. If I decrease this, it's going to basically bring in that oval to allow us to affect more of the image with the vignette. I can change the roundness to be more or less of a perfect circle. Maybe I want it to look more like a film vignette from an old movie projector. I could turn the roundness all the way down to -100, or if I wanted to be perfectly circular, I could set that to 100. And then finally we have feathering. So I could make this more or less soft. Maybe I'll increase that feather a lot and then turn the amount down, as well as increase that midpoint so it's not affecting as much of our frame. Now I can turn that off and back on, and you can see what an effect that makes. All right, that was a lot, but hopefully a good overview of how all of the controls in Lumetri Color work. This is a really powerful effect in both After Effects and Premiere, and in Premiere's version, there's even some more controls that I think make it even more advanced. If you're interested in color grading, definitely look up some tutorials on how to use Lumetri Color. It's a great tool when used in combination with Lumetri scopes for setting exposure and making sure that your image is nice and balanced, and allows you to take some of the trust basically off of your eyes and what you think looks correct, and actually visualizing it on these scopes that are telling you hard numbers so you can know what's correct. It's also a really great tool for making adjustments to skin tone, to properly white balance, and to make sure that any color casts that are shot with your footage are removed or corrected. There's a whole lot you can do with this effect, so it's definitely worth researching and seeing what kind of adjustments you can make with it. But that's everything you need to know about Lumetri Color. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, then check out the other ones here on my YouTube channel. And if you like my teaching style, then definitely check out my longer form content on Skillshare and School of Motion. And if you want to support more tutorials like this one, check out my Patreon. You can find links for all of that stuff in the description of this video.